Hey guys, it's Josh Clark from NS Modeler 24 on YouTube. Just want to welcome you back to Layout and welcome you to the Scale Trains channel today. And I thought we'd just take a few minutes to look at how to weather a BNSF -9. This is a Scale Trains locomotive, and we're going to show you really how to make a great model even better and how to make it stand out in your layout. And I've been very fortunate to have a lot of people share some advice and techniques with me, and so my goal is to really share that with you guys today. So for the next few minutes, enjoy as we weather this BNSF -9, and it's time to model. Hey y'all, welcome back to the Scale Trains channel. Today we're taking a look at a BNSF -9, and other than renumbering the locomotive, it's a factory straight out of the box model. So really great details, and adding a little bit of weathering is really going to help that model stand out on your layout. So that's what we're going to show you today and take a look at. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and mask off some of the windows and headlights. You can also mask off the number boards if you don't want those to be weathered as well, but I opted not to for this locomotive. After that, the second step is going to be to give the locomotive a quick clear coat, and that's really going to seal everything in and give the rest of the weathering a great base to stick to. And the third step, which we're looking at here, is actually going to be a quick fading technique, and this is going to help fade the paint down. Now, the orange out of the box from the factory is kind of dead on for how the locomotives were delivered, in my opinion. However, once these locomotives have been on the road for 5 or 10 years, you'll notice that the green and the orange, or really, if it's black, if it's a Norfolk Southern locomotive, or yellow if it's a Union Pacific locomotive, is really faded down after multiple years on the road and, you know, being in the elements and in the sun 24/7. So this is a great way to recreate that, and you kind of need an airbrush for this, in my opinion, to get that great looking fading effect. But what I'm using here is a PAASCHE airbrush. It's a single action airbrush, and it's a great starter airbrush. In my opinion, it's a single action. Like I said, it's pretty basic, but it really helps you learn the techniques of airbrushing and weathering. For the paint, I'm just using a white paint mixed about 50% paint to 50% thinner. And usually you don't need to thin paint down that much for airbrushing, but since it's such a thin coat, I want it to be really evenly applied. And I think that's just kind of the best results I found for the fading. So about 50-50 mix for the thinner and paint here, and this is just a Model Master white. It's an enamel paint, so I'm using paint thinner as the solvent. So one thing to note when you're airbrushing is just make sure you get all sides, and also, you know, approach the model from different angles instead of just going straight on back and forth. Try going, you know, 45-degree angle to the left and then a 45-degree angle to the right as you make your passes over the models. That's going to make sure that the paint gets in inside of all the cracks and on all the surfaces, because there are a lot of different complex surfaces and geometries on these locomotive shells. Next, we're going to start applying a little bit of the brown, and this is going to be the underbody weathering and grime. Now, I've actually clear coated the model in between this step, and that just really seals in the fading effect that we applied earlier. So I let that dry for several hours and then clear coated it. Now we're going to come back and add some of the dirt and road grime. This is really just from wear and tear, kind of like your car gets dirty. Same thing with a locomotive, you know, and being on the road, traveling across the desert or the forest or the mountains, you know, wherever these locomotives go, they get a bunch of road grime and dirt on the trucks and fuel tank of the locomotive. Usually it doesn't make its way past the walkway, but it's very noticeable whenever you look at prototype pictures or even see the real trains going by. Take a look at the trucks, the fuel tank, and the underframe. You'll notice they're a lot dirtier than the rest of the locomotive in most cases. So here I'm using a light brown by Model Master mixed with a little bit of gray and a little bit of black to just tone it down a little bit. And you can kind of custom mix your paints to match the prototype locomotive that you're going for. For instance, if it's out in the desert, if it's a BNSF or Western Railroad, sometimes a little bit of a lighter color, where if you're modeling more of an Eastern Railroad and they're up in the mountains, sometimes it's more of a darker brown. It really just depends on where the locomotive's been and traveled and how often it's washed. So that's just something to keep in mind. It really varies by locomotive and by railroad. So the best thing you can do, in my opinion, is just to look up some prototype pictures of the locomotive you're trying to model. So again, once I mix the paint, I thinned it down a little bit, this time about 60-40, maybe 70-30. I kind of eyeballed it. You want a consistency of about a thick milk, or even just a regular milk. I know it's kind of a silly analogy, but it's something that somebody told me a while back and really has been pretty true to me as I've weathered these locomotives in the past. So you can always test it on a cheap locomotive, or a junk shell, or even a piece of wood beforehand, and I would actually recommend that before taking it to the model. Again, here, kind of like I mentioned with the fading, I'm approaching the model with several different angles. You can see, especially with the side fuel tanks and the complex truck geometry, coming at it from several different angles really helps you cover all the surfaces. Another really important thing with airbrushing is to make sure that you're working in a well-ventilated area. You don't want to do this inside unless you have a paint booth like we have here. And even though you can't hear it, we do have a fan running to pump all those fumes out. So you can see here we've added a really nice brown, dirty effect to the underside of the locomotive, and it really doesn't make its way too much onto the side of the locomotive. Occasionally, like I'm applying here, you'll notice kind of near the front on the cab, some of the dirt kind of works its way up there. So that's what I was applying there, and we'll add a little bit more to this side as well. And you'll notice the key to airbrushing is really layers. It's kind of tempting. It's definitely quicker to open up the nozzle, let a lot more paint flow out, and just get it done quicker. I found it's better to really tone down that nozzle and just apply really, really small layers, one at a time. And, by the end of, applying the underbody wash and grime, you've probably added 20 to 25 layers, but they're so thin, they come out to have a really nice effect. So I'm going to clear coat that after it dries. Again, I waited a couple hours and then gave it a quick clear coat, actually a dull coat. It's the same one that I've been using this whole time. Now we're going to come back and weather the long hood. Now this is my favorite part because it looks like a 5-year-old is weathering this by just applying powders everywhere, but you'll see there is a method to the madness, and there's a reason I'm doing this. And if you look at a lot of the prototype locomotives, you'll notice that a lot of the dirt and grime gets kind of worked into the cracks and crevices of the locomotive. So that's what I'm doing here. We're actually going to come back and wipe it off, so don't worry, it's not going to look this bad. But this is a neat effect. I found people using washes and thin paint. I think that works great. This is just a technique that's worked really well for me, and I think it's really easy. All it is weathering powder and water and a paper towel. That's all you need to achieve this effect, and you don't need to buy any expensive paint that can kind of fill the cracks in. So, you can use whatever method you want. This is just one that I found works well for me, especially on big flat surfaces like this. All right, so what I'm doing is now going to dip a small paper towel in some water. I'm then going to dab that onto something else to get rid of some of the water. So it's really just a damp paper towel. You don't want it dripping wet because then you'll kind of ruin the effect you're going for. And then I'm simply just going to wipe off the powder. I'm going to start by doing horizontal wipes to wipe some of it off, but you'll notice that as we remove the weathering powder that we previously applied, it's actually leaving some of the dirt and powder inside of the cracks, and that's the exact effect we're going for. The detail of the shell is really well done by scale trains, and I think by adding this effect, it really helps highlight some of the details and the quality of the shell casting. So you'll notice that on the front of the locomotive, you'll see me do this on the side of the locomotive as well. I begin by just broad horizontal movements to kind of wipe it off, and that helps get rid of the bulk of the material. However, with any weathering, it always, occurs mostly vertically. So from top to bottom, as rain, washes it down, washes the weathering and dirt and rust down. So whenever you do big horizontal movements, you'll notice if you look really closely, there's actually horizontal stripes, kind of just from wiping it. It leaves a little bit of residue. So you can come back if needed and wipe it vertically, and that'll make sure that all the weathering effects and the pattern that's left behind is vertical, kind of like the prototype. So you can see it's not a huge difference, but if you click back to just a few minutes ago in the video, you'll notice actually how much better this makes it look in my opinion. I do this to probably 90% of the locomotives that I have. Unless you're modeling a brand new locomotive, this is a really great way to make it stick out and look really good. In my opinion, it just adds a lot of depth to the shell and realism to the weathering job. Also, another benefit to this is you don't even have to weather the grills. By doing this technique, a lot of the radiator grills and intake grills in the back of the locomotive are black from so much use, and it takes a lot of time to mask them. This is another neat effect and way to weather those without having to paint them at all. You'll notice that I used the brush and the weathering powders to paint them on, and then I just removed everything else. And we have great looking black and darkened grills in the back of the locomotive here that was super easy to accomplish and just took a few minutes. So I'm also going to do the top of the locomotive here. You can see that the engineer side in front of us is already done, and it's going to be a little bit heavier up here. So I'm going to do the same effect, wipe it off to get the weathering powders inside of all the cracks and crevices of the shell up here. Then I'm going to come back and add a little bit extra because that's the exhaust stack there, and a lot of times the exhaust is obviously going to make the weathering a lot more. It's going to be a lot dirty on the top of the locomotive, but also they probably don't clean it as much up there, so you'll notice the top of these locomotives are often quite a bit dirtier. And it's also, I think in my opinion, one of the most important parts of the model to weather because you see it most often as you're looking down on the layout and seeing the trains from above as you run them. I'm also going to weather the grills on the back of the locomotive. That's the radiator grill in the back. And again, I'm using that same technique by applying some weathering powders really heavily and then coming back and wiping them off. I'd also recommend if, like in the radiator section in the back of the locomotive, if it is a thick and there's a lot of extra weathering powders around, just using, your breath to blow away some of the extra powder. That'll help it from kind of getting clogged up or getting too thick if there's a lot of powder underneath the grill detail back there. So again, just wiping everything off with a paper towel. I've noticed that about every couple minutes the paper towel gets too dirty, so I'll just tear a new one off, just a couple inch by couple inch section, wrinkle it up, and then re-dampen it to start removing the weathering powder again. So here's a neat way you can see it, just really easy to darken up those grills a little bit more than they come from the factory, give them a neat dull black effect, and you can see it just looks really good up there. And it's a really easy technique, but also looks really good as any other in my opinion. Occasionally on the fine detail of the etched grill back there, you'll get a little bit of paper towel residue just from it tearing apart as it goes through the detail back there. You can just use your finger to wipe that off. So after applying a little bit more around the exhaust stack, I'm going to give it a quick clear coat again to really seal everything in, and then we're going to add just a few more final touches and details to really make this weathering job stand out and to finish everything up. The next step is going to be to highlight some of the details on the truck frames and on the locomotive fuel tank. Kind of like we did on the shell up above, we really highlighted some of the cracks and details. We're going to do the same thing for the trucks below. And I just wanted to mention real quick that I did clear coat this. If you try this technique without clear coating it, you're going to remove some of the weathering with the airbrush that we applied previously. So it's really important to let the weathering dry, clear coat it, let that dry, and then come back. So this can be a fairly long process, which takes several days to let everything dry. But in my opinion, that's kind of the best way to do it to really achieve the best effect. So for the trucks, I'm actually not going to use a weathering powder and damp paper towel effect. I'm going to use a very, very diluted black paint, almost see-through. It's definitely the consistency of water. And by doing that, you're able to touch just the details of the locomotive, and you'll see how the paint really just kind of soaks into all the details. And this is the same effect that we're trying to achieve with weathering powders and water that I showed you before. However, since there's so much detail on the trucks, it's not such a big flat surface, it's really hard to get that same effect with the weathering powders and paper towels. You also have to worry about damaging some of the details if you were to use that technique. So even though this is a little bit different, I found this to be the best technique for weathering the trucks. So what I'm going to do is apply all of it with a brush and then come back with a little bit of a thicker brush and wipe some of it off. And this does two different things. One, it gets it off of the surfaces so it really soaks in and stands out in the cracks like the sprung trucks and the springs, and then just in the details of the trucks. But it also gives you a neat vertical wash effect. You'll notice that a lot of these BNSF trucks, especially the silver trucks, I guess it would apply to the Santa Fe trucks as well, have some interesting weathering and streaking effects just from rust and dirt kind of falling down and being rained on, I guess. But if you look at prototype pixels, you'll see what I'm talking about, and this is a neat way to recreate that. And if you wanted, you could even come back with a little bit of brown afterwards. We're not going to do that today because 5091 wasn't that dirty, but I have seen some BNSF locomotives with some pretty rusty and dirty trucks with some neat vertical streaking, and this is a neat way you could recreate that as well by just switching the color of the paint. So here you can see just removing some of that, and you'll see the streaks that I'm talking about here. And what I'm doing in between is actually wiping the brush off. I want to keep it dry, so you'll see I wipe off some of the paint. As I go over the trucks, it does get a little bit wet, so rather than continuing to spread the paint, I'm actually removing paint here and leaving it in the cracks. Last thing I'm going to do is apply a little bit of a wash to the nose of the locomotive. A lot of times the windshield wiper fluid builds up on the locomotives. I don't know if it damages the paint or if it's just the residue, but whatever it is, a lot of locomotives have this. So I'm using a thin gray paint here to kind of recreate that effect. So what I'm doing is just painting underneath the windshield themselves, and then using a little bit of thinner to kind of pull that paint forward. So I'll lay a bead of paint down in the front, and then clean my brush, use a little bit of thinner to pull it forward, and it gives you a neat blended effect like you'd see in the prototype. So that's it for today, folks. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.